Hello everybody, Lumini here. Now I'm going to be doing this sort of live stream style, just because I'm too lazy to set up OBS and do record, stop record, and all that stuff. So that being said, Master Rank 1 is a very interesting place because in general, it's not run too much just because for the most part, a lot of the monsters tend to be pushovers, especially whenever you start using the much stronger weapons like Greatsword, Dual Blades. For Iceborne's case, I'm going to say Sword and Shield's actually a rather strong one. And then, of course, like bow or some of your bow guns. Now, that being said, I personally do find Master Rank 1 monsters to be quite interesting, mainly because since they aren't run too much, it leaves quite a lot to be explored. So I'm going to go ahead and just give my overall thoughts on some of the monsters. Now, I've run the monsters using the TA Wiki rule set, which is a rule set that aims to make it as much of a fair fight as possible as its core philosophy. Hunter versus monster, with as little gimmicks as possible. So that's why in the runs that you see me doing, I don't use any traps, I don't use any mantles, or I don't use a palico to help assist in that. And on top of that, since I'm using gun lance, I'm not abusing the gun lance glitch that's definitely there. And just me personally, I've seen the gun lance glitch once, twice, at least 20 times now, and I think for the average viewer, it's just not very entertaining. Now, I will say that in doing the Master Rank 1 monsters, I do think that it's a nice way to somewhat practice your weapon of choice, especially if you're not very familiar with it, or maybe you haven't played in quite a while and you need some sort of a de-rusting, which is definitely nice to do. But let me also discuss a little bit more about it. I think in doing the Master Rank 1 monsters and just kind of easing yourself in, you can kind of see some of a couple starting concepts that I think can help people out, whether it's abusing trip blocks or utilizing parts of the map as best to your ability as possible. Like, for example, for Banbaro. Banbaro is a very classic case of abusing the hell out of a trip block just because, for whatever reason, despite how large this guy is, they gave him the most fragile legs in the world. And in learning your trip block sequences, it ends up kind of teaching you that even though, yeah, its head is the weakest spot, it's not the only viable spot to go for, and sometimes there are better methods to achieving a faster hunting time. And then, that being said, and then you have a monster like Beotodus where you can't necessarily trip lock him, and so you do have to put a bit more effort into the fight because he's going to be repositioning himself quite a lot. And in which case, for me, I would say that this fight really emphasizes the idea that you have to be mindful of the monster and what it's doing, because to me, I think Beotodus has a lot of weird movements that aren't conventional, maybe because it's a Piscine wyvern to begin with. And not only that, but I also think that it's also a good introduction to dealing with different armor states, so to speak, because not every monster has different armor states, but there are some monsters where, like, depending on how the fight's going, the hit zone values are going to be changing, and it definitely changes how the fight plays out. And then on top of that, it also kind of teaches you that just because a monster is standing on two legs doesn't mean that it's going to just fall over. Because in my experience fighting Beotodus, he has not tripped once. However, since he is technically swimming underground, by knocking him out of underground, it at least shows me that it will give me a window of opportunity and rewarding me for being able to keep up that aggression. And then you have something like Great Jagras. I think Great Jagras is a very fun monster, just because he's super easy to bully. But I would also say that it's a very good example of how much of a difference your hunting times are between TA Wiki rule sets and freestyle. In which case, with freestyle, it's like the name says, pretty much anything goes. And without the use of the drunk bird landing, then you're looking at a minimum of, I want to say at least a minute, because, well, granted, I haven't timed it out necessarily how long it takes from base camp to Jagras' spawn, which is like over here in area 2, and it's quite a far walk. And just in general, like with a lot of the freestyle versus regular monsters, you're always going to have a much faster time, unless of course you're fighting the special arena, but that's its own thing. And then we also have Kulu Ya-Ku. Now, Kulu is a very neat fight because besides the fact that it introduces like a differing hit zone, it also kind of shows you the problem with just running TA Wiki rules in an Iceborne environment, because monsters are very prone to fleeing, especially if a weaker monster like Kulu is in the area, and then all of a sudden a stronger monster, or what probably the game's coding considers as a quote-unquote stronger monster, like Barroth or maybe Raytheon or Diablo shows up, in which case Kulu's gonna flee. He's gonna get the hell out of there. And that's something that you have to account for whenever you're dealing with your runs, and sometimes you might find yourself restarting until you actually get a proper monster rotation on the map. Because I would say that with this particular monster, it becomes much more evident that not only does your spawn matter, but it also matters as to who is on the map. Because depending on the right combination of monsters, you could be having a bad day. Or if the right set of monsters shows up, then you'll be hunting very easy. Just for Kulu to run away, because Kulu's got a very fast runaway counter or timer. And then you got Pukei Pukei, in which case Pukei Pukei's starts to get unique because you actually have, oh, there it is, 2 different maps for Pukei, and in which case, as a runner, you gotta decide, A, what's your preferred map to fight a monster on? Because depending on you, like let's just say whether you just want to get a fast hunting time on a monster, or maybe you just want a fast quest time. I think this is what matters, and I think for a lot of people, they prefer to have a fast monster time, which is also why you would end up seeing Special Arena for a good majority of the runs. Because I'll say that for Ancient Forest with Pukei Pukei, it gets quite annoying because the area that he typically spawns in, which is Area 6, you're going to be finding that since that area is essentially like 2 giant hills, depending on your weapon type, you're going to be finding yourself doing a lot of sliding moves, especially with your closing attacks. Or if you're hammer, then if you're charging up your hammer and you start sliding downwards, you're going to be doing the spin to win move. And for some folks, that gets quite annoying. And on top of that, it also definitely changes how you have to deal with certain attacks. Because if you're in a flat area like the Special Arena, then you can actually dodge Pukei's double lick attack by standing right underneath his chin. However, if you're in Area 6 of the Ancient Forest, that's no longer an option. You actually have to guard it, or you gotta do a double dodge on it, or just, get the heck out of the way. You can no longer just stand underneath the chin, because the hills will put you at Pukei's hitbox range. And then on top of that, you also have to deal with the fact that, like in Taster's Tour, Pukei will typically spawn right outside of Area 3, and then after beginning the engagement, he's going to run immediately to the middle of Area 3. And so you honestly find yourself spending quite a bit of time just running at the very beginning, and then you gotta wait a little bit in order to finally engage with them. And then on top of that, you just gotta pray that the Gajalaka are on your side and don't decide to kind of mess you over. And again, I think Puki's also a good example of monsters changing states, although it's a bit more subtle, just because for Puki, it gets the fat face state whenever it actually successfully does its double lick attacks, and in which case, all of a sudden, the poison gas or poison spit attacks that you can normally just super armor are no longer super armorable. And they have a much larger radius, which is a pain in the ass to deal with. Now, Barroth is annoying. He's always been annoying for me, and I think he's just kind of an annoying monster for a lot of folks. Just because his weakest spot on his body are literally the two tiny nubs that he calls arms. But I will say that I do think that Iceborne makes him significantly more tolerable. In that since tenderizing exists, you can now create a zone where it's more of a forgiveness zone, and I think I've said that in my video as well about Barroth, and that you create yourself a zone where you no longer have to bounce. But since he's going to be trying to force himself to be facing you all the time, if you have a weapon that's a little bit slower to reposition and a little bit slower to get out your strongest attacks like Gun Lance, then he's a little annoying, but he'll do. I mean, he's not the hardest fight in the world, you just gotta properly position yourself. And I think he's also like maybe a good example of like how certain skills, like let's just say earplugs, are pretty critical for getting in some openings or getting a good start, I should say. Let me see now. Jyuratodus. Jyuratodus, to me, I honestly like World and Iceborne's iteration of Jyuratodus. I'm not a big fan of Sunbreak's iteration, just because I don't think Jyuratodus should be having a large or a small roar or a large roar to begin with. Well, anyways. Now, Jyuratodus is pretty neat to me, just because kind of like Beotodus, where you're dealing with the different armored states, but you're also kind of dealing with the fact that he's also kind of altering the environment, and I think he's actually one of the very few monsters that actively alters his environment, and by that I mean he actually creates these little mud mounds as he does his different little swipe attacks or mud attacks, which alters your character's height and kind of where your weapon ends up hitting. So I think that's actually pretty neat. But as a fight in general, it's not a very complicated fight, and he just kind of staggers a lot, or he claggers a lot. And so depending on your weapon, that's either a great thing or an awful thing. For Gun Lance, I think that's more of a neutral thing. But I think with any weapon in general, you just kind of want to push them into the wall. Tzi-Tzi Ya-Ku. Now, that was the last monster I did. Now, I will say that with Tzi-Tzi, he is the perfect example of both the positioning on the map and your monster roster on the map being absolutely crucial to a good run. Because if Odogaron's on a map, Odogaron 9 times out of 10 is going to interrupt. But if Paolumu is on the map, then you can almost or probably guarantee that you're not going to be interrupted just as long as your fight begins in Area 8. Because if your fight begins in Area 8, super simple fight, very easy. If you begin the fight in Area 2, you're not going to have a very good time, just because Tzi-Tzi's very, very erratic in his movements, and his repositioning is annoying to deal with, I will say. And so, with him being in Area 8 with those little, with the trappable floors, that's still legal in TA Wiki standards, thank God, because otherwise you'd lose an entire spawn. Or you just lose an entire area that you can actually fight in. That makes the fight significantly much more bearable. And not only that, but it's also, again, another showcase that sometimes damage skills are not the only skills you need to be considering. I mean, stun resistance 3 makes this fight a very, very easy cakewalk. And that kind of leads into this next fight, grinding my Girros. Great Girros is interesting because since it's a lower rank monster, it's actually one of the few monsters that we get that's essentially a giant mob fight where he actually actively commands his little buddies. I mean, Great Jagras technically is a mob fight too, but he's nowhere near the leader that Girros is. And so you gotta respect the man for having his own clan to just help gang up on you to fight him. And again, another fight where having or considering paralysis resistance, so sacrificing a little bit of damage, can be a big changer for the fights, because I would say that by having the paralysis resistance, you open up a lot more windows over the span of the whole fight. Because yeah, technically you could run it without running any resistance, but you really have to monitor how much of the paralysis fangs and paralysis bites you're tanking throughout the whole thing, whether it's like a small nibble from the little guys or if it's like the quick bite that you can super armor from the man himself. Otherwise, thankfully, other than that, I'll actually say that Girros is one of the better monsters to kind of get acquainted with in regards to running or speedrunning the quests in the game, because he's one of the few guys that actually has a very consistent spawn, and I think that also plays with the popularity of running different monsters, is how consistent are certain spawns. Because I could tell you right now, Jyuratodus, even though he's not really he's not a ran monster too much, he's actually rather enjoyable because you know all the time he's going to be spawning in Area 10, no matter what. Taster's Tour, again, Pukei Pukei, 9 times out of 10, spawns right here, so this area is not too bad. And same thing with New World Problems. Pukei spawns over here, Area 6, so he's always predictable on where he spawns, and then if you do get the rare spawn where he ends up in Area 5, then that's just the cherry on the cake. But again, that also kind of introduces the other issue with running monsters on the big map, is when you have the rare spawn like Tobi-Kadachi, because I think the spawn where he ends up in Area 5, we're probably looking at somewhere around a 30% to 10% spawn. He doesn't come here very often, otherwise he's around the area, whatever this is, spawn. And that's pretty frustrating for folks, especially since if any monster spawns in Area 5, you're looking at a time that will be faster than your special arena time, just because you just take 2 steps and you're there, as opposed to special arena where you're probably taking at least a good 25 seconds to get to the monster in the first place. Not only that, but I think in Tobi's case, fighting him in the ancient forest ends up being a lot easier anyways, just because the trees that he actually climbs on, they're a lot closer in distance than the walls in the special arena. So I think that's also like a big thing. Now, let me see, who else I gotta talk about? Oh, and of course, Tobi's also, again, a good introduction to monsters and their changing states and how their movesets end up changing as a result. And then we got Dodogama. Now, I was actually very surprised at how easy Dodogama was to bully, and he's also an instance where, at least just for Gunlance's case, you don't always have to pendularize the monster, especially depending on how juicy the hit zone ends up being. But I also think it's a unique showcase to where Iceborne's mechanics kind of rewrites the scripts for some of the monsters, because I can tell you right now that if this was base world, Dodogama's face will always explode pretty much on every single big stagger towards him. However, due to the clagger mechanic being the thing, it actually overwrites some of these staggers. So as a result of that, with Dodogama, you could keep him in the superheated state for quite a while, like much longer than what he's normally supposed to do. And so as a result of that, you end up getting significantly more damage, and you kind of keep him in a loop where he's just constantly having to restart himself over and over again. So I think that was actually really neat to see in action, because I know casually for some folks, I would say that if you're trying to get a lot going on somebody like, let's just say, Tiastra, where let's just say you're using hammer, sometimes your things start overlapping each other and they start canceling each other out, whether you get yourself a big window because you ended up getting the elder topple, and then you accidentally get the stun, and then right after the stun you think you timed it just right, and then you get yourself the elder topple again, but no, it's not the elder topple, it's the clagger, and then you just have your windows accidentally canceling into each other like that. But since I'm using gunlights, I'm actually interested to see how that goes. But overall, I think my closing thoughts on Master Rank 1 is that some of the monsters are pretty neat. Some of the monsters are pretty easy, but some of them can be very frustrating just because of the conditions of their maps. Like, once again, I'll say that Tobi-Kadachi was actually a bit frustrating if you're only aiming for Area 5, because if anything, I didn't want to deal with navigating through the Ancient Forest, so I was solely relying on Area 5, that or doing the Special Arena. In which case, again, Special Arena quests are very they're very popular just because they're very consistent to run. So oftentimes if you're on PC, people will normally run the mod that keeps the arena quests open at all times. Now admittedly, I have not. Just mainly because for me, I don't want all my runs to kind of end up being we're only doing Special Arena. So as they come, as I'm doing them, I'll like do them as like in rotation and such. But yeah, so that being said, I think I'm gonna end this here, and as long as I finally stop playing Zenless Zone 0 Overwatch 2, because I used to play Overwatch years ago, and then when Overwatch 2 came out, we kind of we fell out of it before Overwatch 2 came out, but when it did come out, we were like, nah, I'm not doing that. But after a while, like, just getting bored of the same games and just craving that team player stuff, me and Kat ended up going back to Overwatch, and we're finding that we're having a pretty good time with it, so we're spending a lot of time there. And top it off, I think I've already mentioned this in a lot of my descriptions, my current job eats up a lot of my time, and so it just doesn't give me a whole lot of time to do this. So, that being said, well, actually no, I lied. Here's what I will say, and now this is me talking from the perspective of a person who moderates leaderboards. These runs are not bad. And in fact, if anything, I would say that me personally, I would actually be more excited to see more of these guys being run, just because I think since they're pretty unexplored, they give out quite a lot of there's quite a lot of a room to fill out some expression there. Now that being said, I understand why people don't really run these, because they're not the most interesting whenever you get super good, and they wouldn't be very hard to figure out just because like freaking Banbaro is solved for Gunlance for the most part. And yeah, but that's all I got. So That being said, if y'all guys liked me rambling throughout my thoughts on Master Rank 1 and its monsters, feel free to like and subscribe, and I will see you guys in Master Rank 2. See you later.